Good afternoon to everyone in this auditorium, whether in person or online. It's of course an honor to be part of this seminar, and for that I would like to thank the curator Teresa Novaes and Luís Tavares Pereira, the invitation, and extend my compliments to the entire organization of Mais Casas, More Than Houses, to which I will modestly contribute to your program from the Department of Architecture of the University of Coimbra during this academical year. To close these 2 days of debate, we will hear, I believe, 2 inspiring talks. We will listen to authors whose practice and research covers 2 stories of revolutions. One that dissects the civic and popular movements that emerged in the Portuguese Carnation Revolution, occupation actions, residence committees, and the political relations that intertwine with the political parties that emerge in this dawn of our democracy. Of so emotionally close we are to that day of April, this story inevitably calls us to our present, in which the housing, still in crisis after subprimes, collapse of the major private banks, tourism, golden visa, for who doesn't know, it's a kind of Roland Garros wildcard to achieve Portuguese nationality, gentrification, Airbnb, and others have pushed up into a new conflict between state and citizens, demanding the right to housing and the city. And another revolution takes as its aim the factors of global warming directly involved in the act of designing and building, calling out our discipline and placing it in the eye of the hurricane of this ongoing revolution. The global warming potential reminds us that our home does not end at the sill of the entrance door. Our home is the whole world, and, surprise, perhaps the best way to nurse it is by using labor and material resources that have always been there, staring at us. For that, we start seriously looking to the process and not only to the output. Pedro Ramos Pinto, historian, is an associate professor in history at the University of Cambridge and associated researcher in the Institute of Contemporary History of the New University of Lisbon and the Center for History and Economics in Cambridge. Reading your short bio, we noticed that finally, Lisbon Rising, urban social movements in the Portuguese Revolution 1974-75 will finally be published in Portuguese. Carlos Oliver Barceló, architect, has a degree in architecture at Barcelona School of Architecture and is, in his words, a stone mason master builder. Since 2009, he is a member of the BAVI, Balearic Social Housing Institute, where he has been the head of the Life Reusing Posidonia project, awarded with the 2021 Life Award for Best Environmental Project by the European Commission. Carlos aims to fulfill the Sustainable Development Goals while questioning a new architectural language. Housing and language, it will be difficult to find terms that better encompass the specific themes of the architectural discipline. Let's start with you, Carlos Oliver, and your presentation, A No Language for a New Model, and then Pedro Ramos Pinto will have the honor to close the seminar, speaking of housing and rights in Portugal, from dictatorship to revolution. Thank you.
Thanks, Ian. Señoras y señores, buenas tardes. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening to everyone. It's a pleasure for me to be with you here in this very nice building. Thank you very much to Luis and Teresa for the kind invitation. And thank you very much to you all for being here right now this afternoon on Friday, instead of being in a terrace, having a beer and starting the weekend. So really thank you very much, and I want to ask an applause for all of you. So, I'm architect and I'm civil servant at the Balearic Social Housing Provider, and we're going to talk about the work that we've been doing the last 2 years, and you will see some projects that we've designed in-house that has been like a prototype project, and also some projects designed by external teams that have won competitions And all of them is this collective research that we want to show you today in this way of frequent asked questions. So I'm going to show you questions that people is doing to me, and I'm not going to say the person, just the place that it's coming. So if we're going to talk about the language for a new model, the first question obviously is, why a new model from Palma? The answer is very obvious, because of climate change. I don't have time to talk about it today because I have a very short time. Whatever you need, if you have any question, you can go there. It has been published March 23. This is the 6th assessment report by the IPCC, which is the organism from the United Nations that is giving you all the information that you really need. It's full of data, like for instance, this way, how is going to heat the planet, or how are going to die the animals, and all this kind of information that is really useful when you have it out. For instance, they're explaining that this data is extremely important, 2030. This is where everything is going to be one way or the other. What we are going to do during the next 6-7 years is going to be extremely important to decide if we're going to reach the goals that we are supposed to reach for the Paris Agreements. Do you know about the Paris Agreements, I guess? Everyone knows about that? Can you raise your hand if you know about the Paris Agreements? Everyone knows, right? So this is the Paris Agreements, and this is what we're going right now. So that's why probably now we are in the moment with the most change related to regulatory standards. So there are a lot of regulations. For instance, the European Commission is working on the new directive of the energy performance of buildings. So this is going to affect all of us, right? So a lot of new regulations to achieve a goal: 0 emissions 2050 and minus 40% of emissions 2030, okay? But the question is, do we know what means 40% emissions? Do we have a shape? Do we understand? I'm going to ask you a question, and I need a feedback, which is, do you know during the COVID lockdown, which was the percentage of reduction of the carbon dioxide emissions when you were at home? Were you at home in Portugal? Yes? So can anyone help me? Which was the percentage of the reduction of the carbon dioxide emissions in the world? What? No, the percentage in it. So, which is the percentage of the carbon dioxide reduction emissions? Like 1%, 100%, 2%? Lockdown, 2%? That would be a hell, brother. Some help. I'm sorry it's in Spanish, but it says, la COVID causó una reducción temporal, which is lockdown at home, the reduction was only about 17%. That means that when we were at home, the reduction was only 17, and we have to achieve 40% in 6 years without being locked down. Everyone moving around, 40%. So the question is, do you think we can do that without the change of model? Anyone in the room believes we can get that goal without changing the model? Can you raise the hand, please? No one, right? So that's why we think we need a new language. Since 1921, it's known that we see and think through language. What does it mean? It means that you cannot see what you don't have a word. If you cannot express, it can be in front of your eyes and you don't see it. For instance, we were told during the studies that in the States at the beginning, the Aborigines were not able to see a train because they didn't have the concept, they didn't have the word. So what they were watching was a dragon of fire, okay? This is the same for everything else. You can pass every day in front of something, like a building or whatever, but if you don't know, it's probably that you don't see it, right? So, The proposal that we want to bring you all this afternoon is like, during the modern movement, it was the expression of the fossil fuel materials, right? So the advantage of the fossil fuel materials is like everything can be done. We have no limits. We've been told it's only about money, right? So if we really want to change the model, we need to be able to reach processes of production without fossil fuel materials. And it comes that everything previous to the Industrial Revolution didn't need fossil fuel materials. That's why we believe that since in the planet there are 7,000 languages spoken in the world, what if we try to recover 7,000 languages of architecture, of the growth, each language related to its specific place? That's why we think that maybe the map of resources of every place, which is linked to the material culture, maybe is one possible solution to work with. Meanwhile, the industries are looking for new solutions. But we remember, we have only 6 years to start changing everything. So since we don't want to wait for industries, because we don't want to play our future in one single card, maybe we can work with something else. So this is the map of resources of Mallorca. And traditional architecture, it's the guide to see all these materials that we have not like having an account during a lot of time. So what about Portugal? Of course, it's the same, and you are very lucky because you already have a very nice guide to the guide. Now you have these extremely interesting books that they show you already, all these guides which are telling you what do you have in your territory that it's very good to build nowadays in order to accomplish the European goals of the 40% by 2030 and the 0% by 2050. And these are very good news. So all these things, these are guides, these are maps that can help you to read the territory. So this territory now, with all these quarries and wood and whatever you may have, is something that can be read in different terms and different eyes. In the case of Mallorca Island, for instance, we have this map of resources, which is that we know that we have lime, we have stone, we have earth, we have wood, like renewable materials, can be wood or anything else. This, for instance, is Posidonia oceanica, which is the Neptune grass that we have on the beaches. And we have, of course, the urban mining, which is like the resources from demolition. We have been talking about that in different words, like second materials. We call it resources from demolition. And let's start with the lime because it's very useful to explain the way of designing. The lime concrete is the concrete that was used by the Romans since 2,500 years ago. And the reality is that it's very fragile compared to the modern Portland cement. So it's not that hard. So what happens is that you cannot design, for instance, with columns or pillars. You have to design with load-bearing walls. So if you design with load-bearing walls and the weight of the building is spread along the foundation, it's good enough. The resistance of the lime concrete is only 5 megapascals, which is 20% of the regular concrete. And it requires sometimes 300 days or even 700 days to get strong enough. Which is the interest of this concrete? That now is not happening, but it can be cooked at 900 degrees. This is a difference because the modern materials usually are cooked at 1,500 degrees. And we cannot reach that temperature with clean energies. So 900 degrees is a temperature that we know we will going to be able to reach with clean energies. And that makes a difference, right? So in order to make these materials viable, it's very useful to have the walls at 3 meters of distance, because this is the kind of weight that these natural fragile materials are ready to load. Does it make sense? And this is, for instance, the first building that we designed that way, and you can see that all the doors are reused. In this building, for instance, besides of changing all the materials that were coming in the building, so we were trying to know the name and the surname of every person that was working producing the materials, to know the labor conditions they were having. We were trying to include like all the different ways to approach to low carbon impact materials, which are like natural materials or reused materials like the doors. Here we reused 100 doors. So, second material in Mallorca, the sandstone. The sandstone receives these kind of questions. Aren't you using too much stone? Won't it run out? What about the impact on the landscape if everyone uses sandstone? So this is the question when you're starting to do 1 or 2 projects in sandstone, which are like 0.1% of the buildings in Mallorca. Everyone is thinking that you are going to get run out sandstone, when in reality, the sandstone is in the areas that they were underwater 200,000 years ago. So 20% of the surface of Mallorca is covered with sandstone. So this is not going to be the problem. The problem is that 12 years ago, we had 20 quarries. And in 12 years, 12 quarries have closed because of the retirement of the old people that they were working on the quarries. Young people don't want to work in the quarries, and that's a way to get the extinction of the material. But this kind of stone has been used for vernacular institutional buildings during hundreds of years. And the quarry, actually, it's very nice. I mean, it has even some architectural qualities, let's say. I mean, you can even reach the same beam of light from Canlis by John Knudsen. You can follow it in the quarry, right? I mean, there is something about this quarry that is not like this kind of gravel quarries. So maybe the quarry has an impact, yes, but it's not as high as the gravel quarry. So when we're talking about natural materials, maybe it's not 100% better, but it's a percentage of degree better than the previous ones, okay? So this is, for instance, the quarry Can Casetes, where we got the stone to do this building that we designed in-house in Palma. It's a building of 2 stories. It's row houses, like the kind of typology that Peter Barber has explained this morning. So you enter in the house by here or going upstairs to the first floor. In the ground floor, there is these stone vaults, which are designed to provide mass, which is a lot of weight to provide free cooling in summer. And in the first floor, we designed a pitch roof because it's cheaper related to the calculation of the structure, because a pitch roof requires less wood than when you design a flat roof. Does it make sense? So with the extra money we get from the pitch roof, we can pay the vaults, because of course this is social housing and we have to fit to these very low budgets. So the building is next to the highway, and this is the structure that I was telling to you with the vaults on the ground floor and the pitch roof. And this is the plan. And of course, the plan is related to the construction of these materials. It's impossible to think a plan in regular terms and then try to use these kind of materials. First, you have to think how to load bear the weight of the vaults and the horizontal efforts from the vaults. So you're going to have huge columns in the facade, and of course these huge columns have to become part of the plan, becoming places to stay, a storage, and things like that, right? And this is the first floor under the pitch roof. That's a kitchen. Another kitchen, and a patio. We use this Posidonia installation from the Mallorca beach. This is a natural-based solution that is very interesting because we provide visibility about this plant that usually when tourists are coming to the island, they think it's a waste, but it's not. It's necessary to provide the clearness to the waters of the island. So the reason, if any one of you has ever gone to the Balearic Islands to swim, is because of this plant, because otherwise we will be having very dirty waters. So this plant can be dry under the sun, and used as insulation in the roof, and then you just cover with regular tiles. And this is how it looks, the building that is not isolated. It's part of a plan with two different buildings and a public space in the middle that has been designed to avoid the effect of the heat islands. So the pavements are draining, and the trees have been designed to provide the shadows to the building to participate in the bioclimatic design of every building. So at the end, this structure is the result of having a very long deep. So since the typology is very, very long, which is nearly 14 meters, you need a lot of windows, and to have a lot of windows, you have to open the facade very much. And this is why you have all these columns in order to have as much windows as possible. And this is the community that the spaces that are below these columns have created. Question number 3. You make everything the same. Aren't you tired of copying yourselves? From Palma. I don't know you, but we're coming like from a context that it seems that every project has to be like different than new, and the reality is that we prefer to believe, like Deleuze, that deep repetition is characterized by deep difference. And as was saying Stephen Bates, the less we require or work to be entirely new, the more refined it will become. That's why now we are in a process of trying to get better in every project. So every project, I mean, it's like you design one single project in your life, and you try that every project gets better every time. This is why I'm going to explain this project in Santa Eugenia, which is like the version 2.0 from the previous building in Palma. You can see that it's a building related to this very small town that has a trombe wall facing south in order to provide hot air in winter, and a very, very clean structure where all the windows are the same, straight one up to the other. Of course, we simulate the winds, the breezes, because it's very important, the cross-ventilation in our climate, and we try to reuse everything that was existing on the side. In the side there was a very small like workshop, and we reused all the stone, the shades, and the tiles, as you can see. This is the shades, this is the stone from the previous building, and the tiles. And this is the patio to get in the dwellings, some private gardens for every tenant. And this is the evolution of the project. So in the first project, since the deep of the site was very small, was only 8 meters, we used a concrete beam. So yes, of course, we're using concrete, and we use it when we need it. And we use it as a very, very precious thing, right? We're trying to use as less concrete as possible because it's something that has a lot of value. So we use when we really need it. And in the other project, since the depth of the plot is 10 meters, we had a space to introduce a third line of columns that provides this kind of double vault space, which is more flexible in terms of use. So this is the plan where all the columns are the same, and this is very important because it's much easier for the builder to build fast. And that's like the most interesting learning from this project, which is that we were trying to build faster, cheaper, easier, and more refined. And that's very important when you are building with natural materials, because natural materials, of course, are more expensive than the conventional ones. This is how we're building the vaults, and these are the kind of spaces that are coming from. So this is what we believe it's an architecture of degrowth. So that means that we don't have to be afraid of this word, because we believe that we can provide a degrowth in the consumption of resources, but a growth in comfort. So every dwelling has like these two places for the living room and the kitchen, and then you have the bedrooms behind with these kind of panels that you can remove it in order to change the plan through years. and I think that's very important. Like, we're providing a building design in order to last hundreds of years or as much as possible, but it has to be very flexible. So if you change the program, you can use it in a different way without doing so much work. And at the end, what's very funny is that you are building in the same way that the Romans were building, with some stones, with lime mortar, and a stone lintel. And that's the first floor, where all the wood is reused or recycled, except the wood trusses. These wood trusses, since it's a structure, we use new ones, but everything else, the ceiling or this is reused wood. And of course, it's insulated with Positanature. We are trying to calculate the comfort for 2050 in order to provide comfort facing these kind of new extreme heat waves that are coming. And what I think is interesting from the process of learning is that we passed from this very first building designed in stone to this last building, trying to make it as precise as possible. And we have learned that when you're building with this kind of materials, it's much better being very ordered to fit the budget than, for instance, moving the windows. That maybe seems silly, but moving the ceiling costs a lot of work for the workers. It's much complicated. You have to be there inside controlling every detail, and it really becomes much more expensive. And also what we discovered is, like, when you're building like that, you require a lot of screws connecting the outside layer with the inside layer. And every time that you are crossing the insulation, you may have a problem of endurance through time, right? So that's why we developed this system of pilasters, so the external layer is more or less self-load bearing, and we are using only connections at the size of the lintel, at the height of the lintel. And it's much easier to control for us as an architect. So you as an architect, you can go one day to the work, and with one single visit, you can control all the execution of every connection in the plan. Does it make sense? But instead, in this building, it's impossible to control. So these buildings may seem like very small scale for you, but we are also building bigger scales, like this one, which is 35 dwellings. This is the first project that I'm going to show you. It's not designed by us, but by external teams. This is by Datae, which are Claudi and Burfau. And this is also this very ordered building, 35 dwellings in Palma. And as you can see, program and the structure is the same. So the way that the walls are disposed are able to provide, like the greenhouse at the beginning and at the end of the plan. You can divide the different spaces, but that's also the way to provide the structure to these very thin walls. In this project, they have been trying to reduce the volume of sandstone to the minimum as possible. So thanks to all this effort, trying to recover this very old material that was nearly under extinction, what is happening is, like, some of the quarries, that most of them, they were working with machines and facilities from the 50s, from the 20th century. Now they are doing investments to get some that's one quarry, that's another quarry that they are getting, like, new machines too, or these other quarries. So it's very important that we architects design with these materials in order to provide the change of the industry. I don't know if that makes sense for you. Another material, ceramics. That's another building in Ibiza, designed by 08, 014, Adrian, and Sandra. This is the project that they presented in the competition they won. They were saying that they were designing with load-bearing walls, but the reality, that's very funny, is, like, the position of the windows was still in a kind of way that was very complicated to build that way. And that's why the final project, the windows were like that. And of course, the greenhouses were much higher. So it's very nice to see how the buildings are, like, accommodating to the comfort, which is the main priority, and the materials you are using. So these are the patios. I would like to remember, so this is the cross ventilation from the facade to the patios. And we're filling, or they are filling the bricks with the soil from the excavation and deposit on again. Another project, in this case, mixing sandstone with bricks. So at the beginning, we were kind of very like trying to be pure and use only one material. And with time, we learn to mix like every resource we have at hand. So in this case, you have the sandstone facades, and in this project by Lluís, Laura, Esteve, Ripoll Tizón, they have like been inspired by the very important. And let's go for another question. And what about the CE mark? How do you complete regulations? This is a very regular question. This is everywhere in Europe. It's not true that all the materials have to have the CE label. So there are some exceptions, and of course the use of these metal materials. Just this one for me. Just this one. Okay. So you're not listening to me. Oh, I'm sorry. So there are exceptions to the CE label, and you can use it in order to recover these natural materials. And of course, in our case, we're accomplishing all the Spanish regulations for the construction, which in our case is the CTE. So of course, in order to do these buildings, we're accomplishing every regulation there is. So let's talk about recovering materials. We have the wood, which was used previously in Mallorca, but now we don't have like local production anymore. That's right. But we're trying to recover the building in order to promote once again the production of local wood. So this is the first building that we have designed, we have built in wood, because the design is by Lloc Arquitectes, by Adrià i Itziar. They won this competition with this building that has the ground floor in bricks in order to avoid water problems to the wood structure, which is like that. And the idea is like to test the advantages and problems you may have as a social housing provider, building with wood in our climate in Mallorca, in the Balearic Islands. Next example is about wood and sandstone. And what I think is very interesting about this project by TED Architects, that you might know them, is that they had done this hybrid structure with wood in the core and the stone in the facade, that it's providing the mass that you need in summer to cool for free, and they're using the wood in the center to build as fast as possible. And what is very interesting is that doing that, they achieve these flexible interiors, and they achieve this like intermediate threshold space in the facade that is also providing the relationship of the building with the context, which is very important, because in Mallorca, for instance, we don't have so much wood. So the wood is not related like to the heritage of the cities. You don't see so much wood around. So doing this kind of hybrid systems, you can use like the resources that you may have. For instance, if we are able to recover the wood local production, but also to integrate the building in the context. And in this case, this is the north facade with smaller windows and the south facade with much bigger windows to get some sun. Another material is rammed earth blocks. This is a project in Ibiza designed by Peris Toral, and you can see also the smaller windows in the north facade and the bigger windows to get some sun in the south facade. This is Jose and Marta, the designers of this very nice building that, of course, the plan is designed from the qualities of these ram earth blocks that they can be produced with the same technology that any concrete prefab factory has. So they can use the same machines and you only need a new mold and they can provide a ram earth piece, which is very interesting because this is a material that all the concrete factories can start providing in a very short period of time. As you can see, it's a very strong material that can provide, in this case, up to 5 stories height, and this is one dwelling. You can see it's very long with a greenhouse at the beginning and a collective greenhouse for the cross ventilation. And insulated with Posidonia once again. Another building with load-bearing earth blocks, in this case designed by Vivas Arquitectos. This is the building under construction, and one of the interesting things is that during the design process, they develop a new piece of lintel for not using other kind of materials. So in order to solve the lintel with the same material, they developed these pieces that now everyone can get, and this is how it looks. We're also working with ram earth walls. In this case, this project in Palma, designed by Angels and Josep, is using the earth from the excavation from another project by Bavi. So we are bringing the earth from one side to the other in order to build these walls. This is how it's going to end up. This is under construction. The wood facade, because it's very expensive, this kind of system of ram earth. So in order to fit the budget, it's very hard in our case for social housing to make a ram earth facade. So they have done like a kind of threshold space in order to solve the facade only in wood, which is much cheaper. These are the interiors. I'm finishing. How I'm going about time? Huh?
I'm not totally sure.
Okay, I'm more or less finishing. We have some co-housing projects. This is one in Esporles, which is in the mountain, so it's kind of protected town. So this project by Lopez Rivera is trying to really fit in the context. This is Emi and Monica doing this project that is like very related to the context in the facade to the street, and then in the patio they are also using this sandstone structure in order to provide these greenhouses. It's also under construction. And these greenhouses is not only for the corridors, but also to provide the heat to the dwellings. So these stressful spaces are also the bioclimatic device in order to provide the free heating system and some collective spaces. This is another co-housing project in Menorca, and this case related to the landscape of the island, designed by Mosh Architects, by Izaskun and Oriol, that it's in a sandstone quarry. Actually, the plot is an old quarry, so there is also this kind of relationship of the level of the quarry and the use of white, and this is the kind of collective patios between the dwellings, and this is the private terrace that every dwelling has. Okay, so we arrived to question number 5. But this cannot be applied on large scale. How would you deal with the city's processes? That's from Madrid, of course, from the capital. The reality is that we have seen very big scales. I mean, I don't know for you, but for us in an island, buildings about 35, 40, or 60 dwellings, this is a kind of a scale that is dealing with the size of the city. It's true that there will be cities that they will not have access to this kind of natural materials. I do agree. And I think it's very important, the urban mining that you have been like talking all the day long, which is understanding the city as the quarries of the 21st century. So this is a project by H Architects in a plot that there was an existing building, that the structure was in a very bad situation, and also the building was out of the urban plan regulations. So it had to be demolished in order to be able to build a new building, and that's why these architects, H Architects, They have reused all the material from the existing building. They have reused 1,000 tons from the existing buildings, and they have done this kind of swimming pools with this mix of lime concrete and Portland concrete to do these blocks with all the reused materials for big pieces and also small pieces. And this is the kind of space that comes from these reused blocks, and you can see the size, right? This kind of 7 centimeters width that is providing a lot of mass for having free cooling in summer. Another project of urban mining, in this case, from the excavation. This project is going to use all the stone from the excavation, a project by these very young people, Teyeonza. They won this competition with these massive walls also, with lime concrete, with recycled aggregates from the excavation that is going to provide this mass. So all these projects that you can see, this is just a very short selection because I have only a short time, is what we think that it provides this language for a new model. And aren't you overusing this kind of raw style? What about a nice plaster? Okay, first answer. The gypsum plaster has a problem, which is that makes very difficult to recycle the material behind. So that's the first point why we prefer to use lime plasters or earth plasters or any other kind of compatible plasters with the reusing of the future aggregates if one day you have to demolish the building. So first time. And this kind of renderings usually are more expensive. So we're using them when the materials that you have behind are cheaper, for instance, when there are bricks, right? But when we have stone, it's too expensive to have to pay the stone and also the rendering. But it's also more important, which is we want to make it visible. This is a completely change of model. I mean, it's very hard to recover the design and the construction in stone. So we believe that it's very important to show that this building, it's made of stone and not something else. So, of course, since the master painted his own bedroom 40 years ago in Canlis, this is the John Knudson house again, we can paint it. But we will paint it when everyone will understand that designing and construct a house in stone is something as regular as any other kind of material. Because what we want to propose is to see to history of architecture in the same way everything. Because what happens usually is that we are using, like examples, what has been designed in the recent years. And it seems that what was built like 100 years ago is not a useful reference to build in that way, because it's not about regionalism. We're not like building in conventional way, but copying shapes, no, or details. We're trying to build with the same materials that the cities were built 200 years ago, but in an update way to make it feasible nowadays. And I think this is the last question. Isn't this a way of building more expensive? Isn't this a luxury product? Okay, answer number one. Due to the green regulations, to build now, it's more expensive than some years ago. And this is a statement. I mean, this research was not possible 20 years ago because of the regular budget that you were having for building. But since the energy performance of the building has produced the increase of the cost, I think you will agree, I don't know what in Portugal, but I'm sure that in order to provide A-rate energy buildings, the cost of the buildings, now it's higher, right? Anyone disagrees? This change has provided that now with the new budget, you can use natural materials, which was impossible some time ago. So the reality is like you have the energy regulations, but you have also the directive about public procurement, which is that as public body, you don't have to go for the cheapest offer anymore, because what it's saying since 2014, and this is like 9 years ago, is that the most advantageous offer is not necessarily the cheapest. Because what the regulations are saying is that you have to include environmental and social conditions. And when you include them, the most cheap offer probably is not going to be the best if it doesn't include better social and environmental conditions. Does it make sense? So, this is about some of the collateral side effects that you may have going for the most cheap solution. For instance, this is the factory where most of the t-shirts and the pants were produced in Bangladesh in 2013, and this is the condition why 1,000 people died. And I'm always making the same question. Do you think you have no piece of clothes at home that has been produced in a place like this? Can you raise the hand if you think that you don't have not a single piece of clothes that has been produced like that? Are you seeing any raised hand? And don't you think this is the drama? I mean, I cannot do that. I mean, no one can do that because it's impossible, because it's not about a personal decision. The only way to do that is through regulations. And in order to have regulations, we have to open a debate about that, because otherwise, the politicians are not going to prove that. That's the reason why we have to talk about all the collateral side effects from every material that we have in the works. For instance, this is what happens when an aluminum quarry breaks down. So sometimes goes like this. So that's the reason why it's so important to use recycled aluminum instead of new aluminum. Not only because of the carbon dioxide emissions, because you have also some different side effects during the process of extraction of the materials. Or for instance, when you're working with rainforest, taking some wood, right? So the reality is like between the real price, between the real price and the price of sale, there is a difference. And the only way to play with that is with a tax. So the products that are going to be sold in the future, that they are not having in account the collateral effects, they will have to have a tax, which is called the Pigovian tax. And to finish, I want to let you know that the European Parliament is working on the prohibiting products made with forced labor on the union market. And this is from last year. And I think it's very interesting to start having this debate, which is, can you imagine not having a single product at home produced with forced labor? That would be awesome. And I want to finish this, like proposing this debate under a very nice tree like this fig tree in Formentera. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Carolus. That was super interesting and very inspiring. My own presentation is very different. But first of all, thank you all for still being here. I know it's very late. I know it's a long week, so I will try to be quick. Also, I'm not an architect, so I feel very ill at ease not talking to my usual audience. I'm an historian. I don't work with buildings, I work with people, and mostly they're dead, so they can't tell me I'm wrong. But it's a challenge that I was very keen to accept, and I want to thank Teresa and Luis for the invitation and for all the work in putting this together. And it's a pleasure to finally be here. For the last 3 years, I've also had the pleasure of speaking to some of the PhD students as part of Rui Ramos's course. And it's always been very interesting and stimulating, so it's a pleasure. So I want to look at the problem of housing from an historical perspective and a political perspective. So really what I want to talk about is something that is behind a lot of what we've been discussing the last 2 days, which is this question of crisis and access to housing and the inequalities that have arise from our present condition. And I want to do that by going back to a time which many of you know very well and that we have seen referenced here many times, particularly because this faculty, Porto, and the Faculty of Architecture here are so closely connected to one of the stories of the Portuguese revolutionary period, which is, of course, the SAL process, which was an integral part of that. But it wasn't the only one, and my work that dates back quite a few years is, in a way, an attempt to look back at the question of housing and the politics of housing in Portugal, particularly through the revolution of 1974-1975, by looking beyond the SAL. And in my own work, which I did over 10 years ago, and that's only now finally being translated into Portuguese, what I tried to do was to look at the city of Lisbon and try and understand how housing became a pressing political issue and what were the implications and the connections of that for the people who lived in Lisbon and for the politics of the revolution itself. Now, I don't want to give you a history lesson, that's not the point, nor do I think that history gives us lessons. What I hope to do is use my perspective on this to open up some reflections and some discussions about what is the right to housing and what does it mean once we get into the politics of housing, which housing is political in many ways, and Carlos was just showing how political housing is, even in the choice of building materials and the choices that we make when we design and construct. But there's also a broader political sense of housing that I want to get to. Okay, so in a sense, my own work about the question of housing in the Portuguese Revolution, I didn't mean to. I started only wanting to focus on those few years, but I'm an historian, and by instinct I ended up having to go very far back. And the question that kept coming to me, and I've actually thought about that again several times over the last 2 days, is this concept of crisis, which is, when has housing not been in a state of crisis, for instance, in Portugal? If you look historically, all the way from the beginning of the rapid growth of the cities, particularly Lisbon and Porto in the late 19th century and early 20th century, we know that there were very large populations living in shanty towns. There were large parts of the population living in overcrowded, unsanitary conditions. We know this because they told us. We know this because we have inquiries from 1905 in Inquérito aos Pátios de Lisboa. We've got the work of social reformers, Ricardo Jorge from Porto and his work on... we know this was a problem, or had been a problem for at least 100 years. So when we talk about crisis, I would like you to ask, there are many forms of crisis, but when has housing not been a problem in Portugal for over 120 years? But then the question becomes, if it's always a problem, if there's always such a large percentage of the population who is not able to live in a dignified, healthy, secure way, why is it that only becomes a political issue at very specific points in time? Why is it that it becomes a very important political issue in 1974 and 1975? Why is it a very important political issue now? And I think, in a way, we're kind of ending up where we started with the first presentation yesterday with this question. So part of that conversation led me to think about what then is what makes the right to housing. And we know one thing that made the right to housing not part of the conversation for very long, although, of course, as an idea and a model, it was available. People were talking about rights to housing since the languages of rights have been starting to be developed in this late 19th century, early 20th century. There were plenty of models already of public intervention in housing, even building it, if not regulating much more. What we see in Portugal throughout the early 20th century and through the dictatorship that starts in the 1920s and into the 70s is essentially this sort of liberal understanding that market is going to be provided, the market is going to provide the solution to housing, the housing question, and what you can do at best is to guide the market in particular ways. And what's interesting is that that is widely shared across the board. In fact, when some people in the beginning of the 20th century start talking about the possibility of emulating experiments from elsewhere in Europe and building public housing, there is actually a reaction by some of the working class movement from trade unions who see this as an attempt to control and pacify them and try to resist and instead defend a model of autonomous cooperative building that's separate from the state. So what I wanted to understand is why from that situation, when in the 1910s and 1920s, the very critical issues about housing were discussed in Portugal, what you had was fights on the street between workers, tenants, and landlords. This actually happened in 1912 in Lisbon over a meeting, where you had demands to regulate excessive profits in tenancies. To a moment in 1974, that for those of you who don't know the story of the revolution, I'm talking to an audience that will know very well, when the dictatorship is brought down in the 25th of April 1974, almost a day after, there is a movement of people that begins to organize to demand housing, and in many cases I will talk about, actually seize housing, and arguing that they do so because they have a right to housing provided by the community, by the state. So what's happened in the intervening time? We know that the dictatorship, which lasted almost 5 decades in Portugal and changed and evolved over time, starting out by being deeply inspired by fascism and moving on through a different kind of authoritarianism until its dying days without ever being any more democratic, did intervene in the housing question. We know we've got lots of brilliant work done by architectural historians and architects on that issue. It was never intended, or perhaps not until very late, not until the late 60s, it was never intended as an intervention, a mass intervention in the housing scheme. It was primarily pedagogical in 2 ways. It was pedagogical because it was meant to be used to educate people to be good citizens of the authoritarian state, but it was also pedagogical because they were meant to be models for private initiative to develop forms of housing. It's not until quite late on that you have, with the construction of Olivais, of Schellers, attempts to massify public housing, even though, as we know, often not targeted at those that most need it. There's a question, this is brought about in part by professionalization and by the input of experts, including Nuno Portas, we talked about here, we've already talked about here yesterday and today, LUNEC and other institutions, and also the kind of embrace by the dictatorship of this idea of developmentalism and sort of the mobilization of capital to transform the state, and in some ways more directed at the construction industry perhaps than at housing itself. Now, my argument about this is a little bit provocative, and it goes back to reading a passage in George Orwell, the English essayist, who, as you know, wrote 1984 and Animal Farm. But in a book he wrote in 1937, which is a social reportage of the effects of the Great Depression in Britain, called The Road to Wigan Pier, he has this really wonderful passage that stuck in my head, where he says he visited this very poor area of Wales, Galge, a mining town, where the local workers were demanding that the houses that they lived in were upgraded, they were given access to better houses. And like a good journalist, he asked the miners, so when did housing become a problem in your district? And the miners turned around to him and said, when we were told about it. So, and this might sound facile joke, but in a way it's part of thinking about, for what was missing in Portugal was the idea that it was the role of the state. I've also got a wonderful quote by Borges, the Argentinian writer, about what people in Southern Europe and Latin America think of the state for a long time, which I think speaks volumes. But the idea that the state could and would and should intervene was just not part of the language, as Casas was saying. Now, the dictatorship's intervention was limited, it was insufficient, it was unequal, it ended up targeting groups that the dictatorship wanted to secure: civil servants, the military, the police, certain parts of the middle class later on. But it had a function of inserting this language of rights into the lexicon, into the political lexicon. And my argument is that practice, that interaction between people in their everyday lives, the development of things like the beginning of social work in Portugal, which is intimately connected with a lot of the developments in public architecture at the time as well, the state starts shifting the boundaries of the private and the public. And in doing so, the dictatorship created a set of expectations that it didn't want to and could not meet. And this is where we get to the revolution of 1974, and for me it helps explain what often, in a kind of easy way, people describe as a moment of an explosion of demands, an explosion of participation. I don't think people wake up one day and they see some tanks on the street and say, this is the moment to go and get a house. This only happens because there's been a process of politicization. There's a whole hidden transcript of politics and the development of a sense of both of identity, community, and obligation that has gone on that allowed people to do that. It's just that they were given an opportunity. And that takes me to the second part of my talk, which is then think, okay, how does then the experience, that the fact that this right is articulated and acted upon in the middle of a social and political revolution, what has that meant and what are the implications? Just to give you a little bit of the narrative, for those who don't know, so immediately after the coup that removes the dictatorship, so people start protesting, organizing, and particularly seizing hundreds of housing units, public housing units that are still unfinished, particularly in Chelas, in other parts of Lisbon. I think some of it also happens in Porto, but I don't know the details of the Porto story very well. And interestingly is that those occupations happen first and foremost from neighborhoods, from populations that already have a relationship to the state. And often it's the people who are on these waiting lists to access these houses. But there is so little of it. It's been delivered so slowly. And it's critically, obviously not enough for everyone, that this has generated so much resentment that often is expressed as allegations of corruption against the housing services. I'm an historian, I'm not a court of law, I can't see if person X they accuse of being corrupt is indeed sort of giving preferential treatment for one another. But the fact that you see this in so many places speaks of this tension. And actually that's being expressed as corruption. So the people are seizing and going and occupying these houses and squatting in and saying, because we don't think the system is fair, so they're going and they're living in houses that often don't even have walls yet, and they certainly don't have electricity, they don't have water. They're not seizing comfort. But the dynamic that appears very quickly is that the authorities that are the provisional authorities, the army that's made the coup, are in a way so surprised by this. This is really not in the plan. And they also themselves in such an insecure position. They need their own legitimacy. that they give the space. They keep saying, don't do that. We're not going to kick you out. Please don't do it again. But nobody's going to be kicked out. Don't worry. We're going to sort this out. Can you guys organize yourselves? And they start to encourage this form of grassroots organization. And very quickly, all these neighborhoods start formally organizing into residence commissions of all kinds. I counted just in Lisbon, just in the municipal area of Lisbon alone, by a year later, there was over 150 of them. And Lisbon is not that big, and if you start seeing the surrounding areas, and in Porto, there are thousands of these organizations emerge in a matter of months. And to pick up the theme of our conference, what they're demanding is housing, but is also a lot more than housing. It is very much the right to the city. It's about, it's what a colleague of mine working on a very similar process in Spain called Casas básicas, it's water. It's often access to a water tap. It's access to a bus stop. It's access to healthcare. Is a vision of a right not just to housing, but to entire sort of basic conditions of living in the city. And also very interesting, and something that's going to be very problematic later on, a right to place. Because in many instances, these shanty towns where they're living and where they're demanding new housing to be built are often situated close to where people live. Sometimes it's very close to the center of the city, sometimes it's close to a factory on the outside, but they're saying you can't just ship us out somewhere. We are settled here, we have our lives here, this is where we have to be. So this evolves, and as the revolution carries on, the provisional governments are trying to find out how to deal with it. There's a number of people, in fact, the vice president of the Lisbon municipality is an architect, Felipe Mário Lopes, who knows Portas and the Cell people very well, and they're trying to manage this, whilst at the same time trying to harness this energy of this popular movement to try and legitimate the creation of a new Portugal, of which, and exactly in what direction, there's going to be very difficult. And they keep responding in several ways. One of those that we talked about is the creation of the SAL, these architect-led multidisciplinary units that go and engage directly with the neighborhoods with a participatory intent in order to build cooperative housing. And that's a project that Nuno Portas, the Minister for Housing in several of the first of the provisional governments, had already been developing before the revolution as a functionary in the housing authorities, but can now be developed and sort of be presented in a much more democratic way. And we know the results of those. We know Bolsa, we know the various neighborhoods across the city, across Portugal. But that's a tiny part of what happened. There's, I don't know how many, 30 SAL neighborhoods in total? Across the country? More than 100? But even that, if you think that in Lisbon alone there was 150 neighborhoods that organized, often for housing, and then more around, this is a drop in the ocean. And a lot of it becomes a struggle, because when they run out of there's so little public housing being built and there's such a long wait, then the next step is for people to say, well, what about all the vacant housing in the city, across the city? And then in a second wave, particularly at the beginning of 1975, these neighborhood commissions start organizing the seizure of apartments in the city that they decide are vacant, and to try and assign them to people they have on their waiting lists. Now, the provisional government responds with an attempt to create a rental law in early 1975, which is really interesting, which is at the same time trying to contain this movement and say, look, we might be in a revolutionary situation, but this is private property, so we just need to create the rules through which we can intervene in private property. And they say we are going to create a system whereby we are going to force landlords who have vacant houses to rent them out at a municipality-decided rent, but we are going to do it. It's going to be centralized, it's going to be bureaucratized in the municipality. It's not going to be this anarchy of residence commissions doing it. And that creates even more tensions because, of course, you know, the system, it's also, everyone's trying to do this whilst having a revolution at the same time. The systems don't work. It's much too slow, and the pressure is building from below. And particularly, this is happening and can only happen because of the context. Because the whole state, the whole nation, is in the middle of a revolution. This, by the way, is, of course, Alves Costa was an architect. I think he was from FAUP, who was one of who led several of the SAL teams. In fact, he was in charge of SAL across. And this is photos he took at a demonstration for housing in Porto in 1975. But what's happening as part of the revolutionary process is that you have a competition between different groups in society with different visions for what the country is going to become. And particularly you have an increasing competition between a camp that says that Portugal is going to fulfill, fulfill and complete its revolution, that it's going to become a popular democracy. Of exactly the different nuances of that are part of the context. But at the same time, you've had elections and you have another camp that is saying, no, we need to have a normalization, we need to have, to respect the democratic choices made, and you begin to have this different dual claims to legitimacy. Those that say that the legitimacy should come from elections where everyone voted, and those claiming no, because people don't really know what they're voting for. What we need to listen to is the people who are doing and creating the revolution on the ground. And it is part of that struggle for power that the urban social movement becomes entangled in this, which both gives it the space for it to articulate its demands, to win many of its victories. But it also means that people are having to make choices, particularly because at some point the revolutionary camp says we are not going to have a parliamentary democracy. What we need is a democracy that's based on organic representative institutions, residents' commissions, workers' commissions, soldiers' commissions, and we're going to have a Soviet-style form of organization. And then this thing that for many people started as a demand for a right to place or a right to housing now has implications that stretch all the way up to the way in which the country is going to be run. And this becomes very problematic because whereas up until June 1975, there was wide support for the urban movement, for the residents' demands across the political spectrum, you start seeing those that defend democratic normalization decoupling from the demands of this movement and increasingly questioning the legitimacy of residents' commissions and asking who elected these people, where are they coming from, saying these people are these are not really residents, these are activists from small revolutionary parties. Some were, we do see throughout as this increases, you start having many more residents' commissions in more middle-class neighborhoods that actually tend to be more radical than the radicals. And you start also having splits appearing in the movement itself, whereas many of those that started earlier in shanty towns and poor neighborhoods start getting worried about what they claim is the sort of over-politicization of the movement. So, and that is in a way where it all ends up. Because the camp that ends up winning, the camp for democratic normalization, for following the kind of Western European model wins, and it partly wins because the opposite camp, when it tries to call out the supposed popular movement that's supposed to be backing it, when it calls them out on the streets, they don't turn up. Actually, they don't have as much support as they claim. But as a consequence of that, a lot of what happens, and a lot of the radical in an interesting and different sense experimentation that gone about sort of thinking about democratizing the city, thinking about voice, thinking about different ways of intervening in the question of housing in the city, get washed away. So the Constitution, which is being written while all this is going on, has and sort of institutes a right to housing for every citizen. But by the time it's approved a year later, in April 1976, there are no mechanisms in it through which this right to a house is going to be activated. In fact, in terms of housing, the SAL program is dismantled. Only a few of the projects actually ever get completed, although they are very interesting. But actually, in terms of really addressing the dire housing needs of the city, is not until really the 1990s and a new state-led program of mass housing, of which the new areas of Shellers and others that we saw before, with lots of capital also from European funds that do change quite dramatically, although without ever solving the housing situation, come in. And in a way, then, what there is of a housing crisis becomes hidden again. And it becomes hidden again until very recently, where it reappears with very different dynamics, with now being led by a middle class who feels increasingly insecure and excluded. So that was the history bit. And so what do I think this can help us think about? Again, not lessons. I don't think history gives us any lessons. Nothing ever repeats itself. I think it makes me think about the usefulness of thinking in terms of rights. Rights are contingent, rights are historical, and rights are always dependent on the mechanisms of activation. It's all very good to put a piece of some words on a constitution, but nobody in this country can sue the state for not providing them with a house and win. There is nothing in the constitutional rights that are actually actionable by the population. So therefore, how can we keep the question of housing as a political question at all times without having to rely on constitutions and bits of paper? And also, again, how do we make the question about housing and dignity about more than houses, the right to place, the right to access to the public services that make urban living possible in all kinds of ways. But also problematizing participation. We hear a lot, and it's become across all fields a sort of mantra and panacea that we should have participation. What exactly does participation mean, and how does it work when it's directed and when it's coming from the public authority, when it's coming from those who pay, those who have the capital, those who have the power to decide, and have the power to decide what questions get asked? Often with all the best intentions that we have, it is a question of power, and is a question of power inequalities. And how then can we create permanent forms of participation that go beyond being tied to a specific project, contingent on funding from some external agency or NGO? How do you give ownership, and here I don't mean ownership in the sense of property deeds, but ownership of a process. How do you make the housing process democratic? When it's so difficult, when it's so conflictual, when it's always going to spill out from the question of housing to the question of politics in general. But that's what fascinates me in the questions of how people organize politically. And a whole other story that I'm interested in is how the built environment itself shapes how people organize politically, but that's a whole other story. But I'm sorry, I know it's late. Thank you very much for your patience, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
First of all, thank you both for such compelling contents. It's 1850, I don't know, Teresa? It's 1850, I don't know how much time we have. Of course, I have some questions for both, but in order to allow the public to participate, namely the students that are present here, I will choose to open the debate now. And any questions, please? I don't know, where is the micro?
Hello, my name is Jorge Carvalho, and I have a question for Carlos, which touches, I think, the last issue that you raised, which is regulation. And I started connecting what I saw in the projects about the mass of the walls and the size of the walls to the regulations. I took this conclusion, but I would like your confirmation or correction that the use of these massive walls is, let's say, accepted by a public developer of housing because it's a policy. But once you get to private developers, probably it's not an accepted system because it will start eating into the usable areas if you consider the same building volume. I'm not sure how it works in that context because if you try to use this system within the same allowed building envelope, then it's not a economically competitive way of building. Do the regulations allow for an extra volume if you use these systems, or really it doesn't work in the private sector?
Well, it depends if you're renting or selling built square meters or usable square meters. So at the end, you have a built surface, and this built surface has a maximum budget to build. So in our case, this is the limit that we're working as a public body, and I think it really doesn't change anything for a private investor, because actually the first project that I designed as an architect was a project which was an hybrid structure with sandstone and steel columns, which were 15 centimeters in order to have as less built surface as possible. The reality is that the quality of the space and the comfort of the space was much lower than we are doing now. So at the end, the problem is selling only square meters. This is a real problem. I mean, the same way that we are saying that which is the real cost of thing, the cost is not in short term, right? So the last question was about saying if the cost of whatever you buy is not only about a building, but everything else, you are measuring it only in short term, you have a problem, right? But if you measure in long term, it's different, right? Do you agree with this? It's the same for a building. If you are measuring only square meters, we have a problem, because what you have to measure is the comfort in the house, because what you're going to face are extreme heat waves during the next 70 years. So, do you really think it's better to buy a house with a built surface, let's say 100 meters, and you have, for instance, 80 square meters, not very comfortable, or 75 meters, much comfortable? Because at the end, the difference of surface is not that great. We are moving around these differences. So I think it's just about changing the values of the market. Make sense?
I was not making a judgment. I understand your position and I agree with it. I was trying that you provide information of how it is really working in your context. If there is a difference between the private sector and the public sector because of different criteria of assessment of this balance between values.
Yeah, I mean, did I answer the question or not really, you think?
You were not clear in the answer because you
Okay.
provided your own assessment. So I guess that really the private sector is not making the same assessment as you are or as we are.
Well, what I think is like, I will try to be more precise. There is no specific regulations. So it's not about regulations, it's about decisions. It's like technical decisions, right? So there is no regional or national regulations about which is the profitable surface of a housing project, right? So it depends on the technical decision about it. And since one of the main goals we're facing is climate change, we have tested this approach with massive surfaces that now it has been developed by a public body. And of course the desire is like in time, this is going to be applied also by private investors. You're welcome.
Did you calculate on how much CO2 you are saving with this construction as compared to a normal construction?
Yes, actually, what we try to transmit is like these indicators are basic to change the model. So the main indicator we are working, the first, is the heating and cooling energy demand, and we try to design every project below 15 kilowatts. So the first thing is to provide the maximum comfort. And the reality is that we have set this limit, which is 15 kilowatts, but we have a lot of projects which move between 5, 6, 7 kilowatts. So we really believe that the demand, it's very low in these projects. And we're trying to provide this comfort through low carbon materials. And, or like the IBABI regulations at this moment were to reduce as minimum, depending on like the level of calculation, because it depends also in the tool, around 30% of carbon dioxide emissions as a limit. But the reality is that we have a lot of projects that have reduced around 60% carbon dioxide emissions. So all these projects designed with sandstone, for instance, they are between 50 and 60. The first project that we designed in Formentera, the one that explained that all the doors were reused, this was around 60% carbon dioxide reduction. So I think what is very interesting is like all these projects which have been published. In every project you have the energy demand, which is much interesting like than the carbon dioxide emissions, because we're not having in account the renewable energy that you're using afterwards. I don't know if I have to explain more about this, but the scenario we are like moving is like understanding that we don't have minerals in the world to provide like green energy to compensate all the emissions of the buildings in the world if we design in a conventional way. So the first thing is to like low down as maximum, right? I mean, it makes sense. We are in architectural school. All the demand, then the carbon dioxide emissions, then the water cycle with the liters of water per person a day, and the waste during the buildings. These are the 4 indicators that we set in every building.
Hello, my name is Pedro Mendes. Thank you for your presentations. I really appreciate it. Sorry, Pedro, I'm going more into the architectural side, but I really appreciate your presentation. And I was wondering, I knew already your work, and how does it work on the process of materials? Because you mentioned that, for instance, the stone process was kind of stopped and suddenly they are improving. How can you move on the process with the builders about the isolation also for the roof? Who does that? Is the local builders, or you incentivize them as a public organization? What is the relation there?
As a public body, we have public tenders for every building. So any building can be done by any contractor that win this public contract, right? So sometimes you're working with, I would say, some companies that they have the knowledge, and sometimes you work with companies that they don't have the knowledge. And that's why Alexandre has presented us like, I think in English the word is like mason masters, which is we have to have the knowledge about how to build with that, because sometimes you need to transmit that to the constructor to help them to build in that way. So I think the main idea we are providing is like, in order to recover these natural materials that were a little bit, I don't know in Portugal, but at least in Spain and Balearic Islands, a little bit forgotten. We have to recover the knowledge and update the way of construction. And this is what we are doing as civil servants. And then we try to transmit that to the companies. And then you have sometimes to play with reality. For instance, for some buildings, when they're very small, you can build it with one single quarry. But when they're very big, it's impossible. So we start like playing with things, like Barbara was saying, you play with reality, and then you start working with all the quarries you have in the island. And some stones are pink, some are red, some are white, some are brown, and you mix all the stones you have in order to be able to have stone enough to make 20 sandstone buildings, for instance.
Okay, so that's a scale movement then, and as far as you keep building, the producers are going for that. Okay, thank you very much.
My name is João Ferreira. I have 2 questions also for you. One is, how do you make the insulation in the massive stone exterior walls? If you have 2 walls or just one, and how it works? And also if you can tell us more or less the approximated value of your cost of construction by square meter.
Okay. We're building with the John Hudson system. I don't know if you know this house, Canlis, by John Hudson in Porto Petro. Actually, he is the first one that is using the 2 stone walls with an air chamber in the middle. So the only thing we are doing is to include an insulation and a waterproof layer in this chamber. So we have 2 layers of stone. The one in the inside is the structure, and the one in the outside, the only function is to protect the waterproof layer from the radiation of the sun. Okay, make sense? First question. Second question, at the beginning, we were building around 1,200 euros per square meter, but what really has changed the price has not been, attention, the natural materials, but the COVID and the war in Ukraine. These 2 things have produced an increase of the prices that at this point they're up to 30% as minimum. So the reality is that right now this 1,200, it has become like 1,500 or 1,600. But this 30% is not affecting only to us, it's affecting everyone. I don't know if the situation is the same in Portugal.
No more questions? I'm going to jump some comments I have to you, and I will directly to the difficult questions, I suppose. Yesterday, I've seen in social networks that they have shared a popular reaction against the abusive appropriation of public space in Lisbon, now invoking the simple right to sit. This was at Paiva Conselho Square, since the available shares are almost granted to private bars and coffees. I wonder, what was the real role of the public space in the April Revolution? The right for public space existed. It was a kind of second line of demands. What can you tell us about?
Thank you, Alexander. I thought I was going to get away without having to answer questions. I thought I was going to be able to get away without having to answer questions. But that is a really good question, and I think it wasn't a second line demand. I think we are often conditioned to read these situations as a kind of hierarchy of demands. My feeling as I was studying these movements and these organizations that they tended to see these things very holistically. And so even when there were discussions about housing, those discussions included questions of public space and open space. But also, even more broadly, because of the situation, I think what was very interesting is that people were seizing public space, and that was very quickly legitimized. And there is a colleague who works in Spain, but also in Portugal, Robert Fishman, who has some kind of interesting comparisons between the way in which the situation in Portugal, because of the revolution transition, public protest was legitimized in a way that it was never in Spain. There is a kind of a tradition of allowing and tolerating public political demonstrations in Portugal, which are always much more problematic in Spain. I think there are things we can qualify in that comparison. But I've written with a couple of colleagues a little thing about this, but it's only a reflection. I'd like to go further with it, which to really analyze in depth and across time the role of the street and its symbolism in Portuguese politics from over the last 60 or 70 years. Because I think in that moment there is a kind of seizure of public space. That it's still very hard and still quite entrenched, and that's why things like the sitting in the square is, people obviously have a right to that. Is what they feel that they have a right to, and I think that dates back to that moment where that was legitimized and recognized.
I don't know if this answer recalls any other question from the audience. You have spoke of holistic And that goes to my last question for you. If we shift from Lisbon to North Africa, we have not the Carnation Revolution, but the Grain Revolution some years ago, as it was also known the Arab Spring. So there the right to the house was surpassed by the demand for bread. Nowadays we have a war in which we have seen the effects of how seeds and cereal production in an oligopoly dominate the world and so on. So I ask you if it would be a short perspective today to read popular actions through just one factor, the house, for example, or would they tend to be total manifestations in which climate, city, gender, race, and of course peace will be holistically together?
I get the hardest questions. I think that is a very good point, and it's something that I've been trying to read and think about. Although as an historian, mostly as an historian, I've also done quite a lot of work on contemporary anti-austerity movements and also other social movements, and also trying to think about the rise again of populism in the light of my own work about the 1930s and the rise of fascism across Europe. And I think one echo, again, I don't think there are lessons, I don't think there are exact parallels, but I think if we can use one word to tie many of these things together and how they manifest themselves in different ways, is insecurity. And I think insecurity is a very powerful political motivator. But the problem is that one thing is to feel insecure, to feel the problem, and then around us there are competing narratives to explain the causes of that insecurity and the potential solutions to it. And unfortunately the narratives that seem to be getting more audience at the moment, or able to mobilize large parts, are answers that we find very troubling if we are committed to democratic principles, to fighting climate change and to adapting the world to it. But I would put insecurity as a key. And the house, the home, is central to that, but it's not the only thing.
Shall we close the session, or is there another question? Okay. It's up to you to end this, or no? Thank you.
Still makes sense. Of course, we took notes, but it's impossible for us at this moment to say something that is really relevant after these 2 intense days. So I keep my notes more to my work for the future from here and what maybe I learn. Not everything I learned, but the things I could keep in my mind. And I will divide that into different things. One is about the process of making architecture. And obviously, it's always the same question that Sophie told us, that is, we have to make first the right question before starting doing a project. So it's not making the right drawing, but making the right question, and obviously find the right answer. And this is a mental process then important. And another thing is we have to, I disagree with Carlos obviously, because architects take risks every day when they are doing their own projects. We are always taking risks. and because that is the base of the creativity to do architecture. So we make decisions, and the decisions are taking risks about the projects we are doing, otherwise you cannot proceed. It's interesting that we make this program about housing, modern housing, and in the end, everyone was much more interesting to talk about public space than housing. So I note for all the architects, public space is something that we care immensely, although we have so many difficulties to work with it. But everyone was talking about the streets, everyone was talking about the exterior, about the verandas, the middle space. So yes, I think in the end, that's what architects really like, is not what they build, but is the voids they create, and that is where we concentrate our ideas. And so going to another subject is that obviously we are in a change moment, in a moment of change. For change, I mean, we've been perceiving this for maybe the last 10 years. For our generation is absolutely change. For the students, that's their conditions. So they'll do architecture in a completely different way that we've learned and we practice, and their demands and the things they have to answer in the future are very, very different from the things that we've done where we start our practice. I don't know if we can catch up, maybe not, but for them, that would be like, they'll be their environment of practicing architecture. And this environment is about reuse and the growth, the growth, did I say well? The growth, which obviously, if someone will tell me this 30 years ago, I wouldn't believe. So we have definitely to get this in mind, because the examples that we've seen here are the ones that are going to lead the future, and we just have really, really to make an effort to adjust on this. And so the funny thing is that we saw this growth and this reuse can be made into different ways. One can be through really high technology way and invest in new technology that help us to achieve this. Or this could be just reusing the knowledge that's been with us from years and years. So these are the two ways that we've seen here in this idea of doing less and building less. And now this is my conclusion, so I have nothing special more to share with you. And just to say that the Faculty of Architecture is going to attach to this program as well a call for papers where the true investigation and research can come out with what they have to say about these problems we talk here today. So soon you can hear and you can look to the site and see this call and normal using the regular ways of advertising these kind of research programs. Okay, so thank you very much for being here, and see you in time. Okay.